Cairo, Seattle.
This is Fight, an MMA podcast with Bob Stelton and Danny O'Neill. Insight and analysis from every angle.
You can't dispute the results.
The fights.
That was the biggest pay-per-view card in the history of the UFC.
Fighters.
We're here with Carlos Condit. He joins us.
Uriah, how you doing, man?
Doing good. How are you?
And everything from the world of mixed martial arts. It's time for Fight.
Bob got blood on him again.
Yeah, from the girls that were fighting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she had a big cut over her eye, and they came up against the cage, and she hit her, and it just was like a paintbrush. Your boy Tony Parrish got it too.
Did he?
Yeah.
Did you clean the shirt or throw it away?
It'll get cleaned.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But you're not going to give up on it.
No, it was like a couple drops. Most of it hit the table. It was like you see our papers and everything, and it looked like a broken red pen.
How do you reconcile your fear of germs and getting sprayed?
I wanted to ask him this.
Yeah, and getting sprayed with someone else's blood while you're working.
I don't know. I don't have an answer. I get asked that every time about training in jiu-jitsu because it's gross. I mean, you're on the mat with 30 other guys, all sweating. You see, we all stand in a line based on rank, and the instructor is talking to us, and you'd been sparring or doing drills, and everybody's sweating, and you look, and there are little puddles of sweat by everybody's feet. And they're like little landmines for me. So then, they'll show us a move, and they'll say, okay, partner up. Bob, Danny, you go over here. You guys over here, and you work on the move. And I'm weaving around the mat and weaving around these puddles of sweat, and you'll see toenails and pieces of skin, and just it's disgusting. It's truly disgusting, and I don't have an answer as to how I get over it. I just sort of try to block it out and jump in the shower the second I get home. I put socks on, right? And those are the last things I take off before I get in the shower because I don't want my bare feet touching anything in my house. Mm-hmm. So I will literally be naked, wearing socks, water's on, open the shower door, take off one sock, put that foot in the shower, take off the other sock, then put that foot in the shower. So my bare foot doesn't touch anything because it had been on the mat with everybody else's funk and everything like that.
So you try to, it's a layer of insulation.
I try to mitigate the damage.
So when you got sprayed with blood at the fight, do you keep talking?
I have to.
So you're professional enough to
I understand the circumstance and what I've signed up for. I can't just take the headphones off and run to the bathroom as much as I'd like to. As much as I'd like to, trust me. I mean, the table gets not coated. That sounds extreme, but it gets a little spray. It looks like somebody just flicks a paintbrush.
Right.
It's like dot, 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 dot. You're like, oh boy. And then you start looking around, and there's a dot on my phone, and there's a dot on my pen. Oh, there's a dot on my shirt. There's a dot on your shirt. There's, it hasn't like hit me on my skin yet, which I think has made it easier. But yeah, it's disgusting.
Is your reaction like, oh, that's unfortunate? Or is it like, oh?
Internally, I'm like, how many more fights do we have? How long until I can get in there and scrub my hands?
When can I get clean?
I need to look in the mirror and see that it's not on my skin.
When can I get clean?
Because I'll look at my broadcast partners and kind of give them a hand signal, like, is there any on me? And it's a quick look, like, nah, you're good. But it's a little bit dark in there, so I'm always of the belief they're not really looking, and there's something on me. So I'm looking at, okay, we got 3 fights left. Okay, we got 2 left. All right, we got 1 left. We close it out, go to the back, and then I'm looking in the mirror like, all right, do I see anything? And then I feel better if it's not on my actual skin.
It's Fight, an MMA podcast. I'm Danny O'Neill. That's Bob Stelton. Bob Stelton, resident jiu-jitsu practitioner and germaphobe. And
it's a real conflict.
We got a good episode. We're going to talk with Nate Quarry, who is an important voice for the overall landscape of fighting and what fighters' rights mean, what it means to work for the UFC, what maybe needs to change. But we should give an update because, Bob, you called the fights this weekend. Emerald Queen, we had Brett Knopp on with us, man kill, and he had an unfortunate end to his fight on Saturday night.
Yeah, he got knocked out. He got tuned up, and our producer Aaron was there for his first MMA event, and he was having a great time. And I think looking forward to seeing the guy that we had here in studio, right?
Very much so.
Guy you felt like you knew a little bit, got to know a little bit. He's a great guy, Brent, and he just, man, he took some big shots in the opening round and walked right through them as he is wont to do. But the second round, he got hit with a straight right hand. You saw the legs buckle. You saw him just get kind of jelly, and there was a follow-up right hand that put him right on his back, and it was done. I mean, I think there might have been one more shot delivered while he was on his back, but he got knocked out. I mean, he got tuned up big time there. And and I saw him afterwards backstage with Matt Hume, his coach, and his wife or girlfriend. They were just sitting there. He was just sitting there eating a sandwich. I'm like, "You all right, man?" He's like, "Yeah, it's part of the sport."
Yeah.
He didn't seem worse for the wear, wasn't beat up, didn't have any cuts or anything. He just seemed like, yeah, that's how it goes, which is right. I guess that's the attitude you have to have. But it's, you talk to somebody, you get to know them a little bit. You're really pulling for them. So it's tough to see it go down like that.
It's one of the more, I don't want to say difficult, it's just part of watching fights, and then you get to know fighters, and then it becomes very personally invested in a way that's different than a basketball player or a football player, because that's so much more. There's strategy, there's circumstance that is involved. Of a fight is one-on-one, and a guy becomes very vulnerable when he steps in there, and sort of all his ambitions are there, and you also see his skill level, and then sometimes the fight does not go the way he's hoping, planning, or expecting it to go. And there's a very personal level of disappointment. It's why I'm convinced you see so many fighters hug each other after, because each of those guys in there knows the risk that they took and has respect for that, the chance that other guy took.
Absolutely, man. They're especially in MMA, there's a lot of honor in that sport. As much as people look at it and go, oh, it's vicious, it's cockfighting, it's barroom brawling, whatever term you want to throw on it. I mean, you see the respect these guys have for each other after they go 3-5 grueling rounds. And as a fan, you're right, it's extremely tough. I mean, I grew up a boxing fan as a little kid all the way up, and I would get attached to fighters, whether it was Sugar Ray Leonard or Evander Holyfield or Pernell Whitaker, these fighters I really got attached to, Meldrick Taylor. And it's so different than being a fan of the Seahawks or the Mariners or the Yankees, because they lose a game, okay, they play it the next night, or a football team plays the next weekend. All right. You've got heroes in combat sports. You watch them get beat up. And it's a different thing to watch somebody you really look up to and root for and cheer for, like a team. It's an individual. See them take a beating. And I remember watching Sugar Ray Leonard, who was past his prime, who was one of my all-time favorites, absolutely get annihilated by Terry Norris, who was a young up-and-comer, and just beat the hell out of him. Knocked his tooth out. I mean, Sugar just took a beating, and I was depressed for 3 days. I mean, it affected me. I felt like I took a beating, and I remember having the chance to interview Sugar Ray Leonard, and I told him that. I was like, man, I was depressed for 3 days after that. He goes, how do you think I felt? He had a great sense of humor about it, but that is the difference in being a fan of combat sports, whether it's boxing or MMA, and watching somebody you truly root for and have an interest or a passion for go in there and lose. It's much tougher to me than watching your team lose, which stinks as well. But they're okay. They lost a game. They'll play next week or the next night, depending on the sport.
We've had a lot of fun on Fight, talking to the fighters, all of the different things that go into it. We haven't spent as much time talking about some of the bigger picture things. We talked about fighters we like, matches we like to see, but the overall shape of the UFC promotion, the structure of MMA fighting as it exists. I mentioned Nate Quarry is going to come on. He's part of a lawsuit that involves several other fighters, including Kung Lee. Kyle Kingsbury is another guy that's there. And it's essentially an attempt to have the UFC declared to be in violation of antitrust laws. And it's a really complicated way of saying that they've been unfair in their business practices. One of the contrasts and one of the challenges in being what I would consider sort of a conscious UFC fan, I love the promotion and I love the fights and the events they put on. It's also difficult when you look at some of the compensation that fighters get and the question just how the sport is structured financially. And you'll hear it with Nate. Look, you see a lot of times that guys, I think I'm trying to remember back, the first fight that I covered in person, it was 2006. And I'm pretty sure that the fighter, it was 75 and 75. It was Chris Lieben and he had a contract. And it was $7,500 to show and $7,500 if he won. So it's a $15,000 payday that's there at the top end.
Right.
And then you also have fight of the night bonuses and other different ways that they've done to incentivize fighters. But when you realized what that was, is these aren't guys that are getting direct deposit over 2 weeks. They're not getting something. And when Lieben gets the check, he goes to the casino cashier right there to get it, and his trainer is there, and also the guy that ran a fitness gym right next to the trainer. Both guys who had basically financed and helped him train for the fight to give them their percentage. You realize what a tough life that is. And that's a guy that's fighting on TV. Like, that's a guy who, quote unquote, has made it, who has a contract at that point. It's a real challenge.
I feel conflicted because I've talked to Nate a number of times, and I know his story, and I know where he stands on this issue, and people will hear it. And he's got excellent points and gives you behind-the-scenes details of the business. And I feel conflicted because you hear it and you go, man, that's wrong. It shouldn't be that way. Yet I'm on the other side of it. I'm the guy that will pay for every pay-per-view. I'm supporting it. I love speaking with Dana. I don't work for Dana, so I've got a much different view of him. And for our purposes and my interaction with him has always been awesome and positive, and he's been gracious with his time. But then you hear the other side of it, and I feel completely conflicted that I'm part of the problem on some level. I'm supporting everything that's wrong. You know, the fighters are the product, you know, and I want to support them, but it turns out you're kind of not, in a way, right?
It's a very challenging, that's what you just said is exactly right, that you're supporting the profile that they have, and look, you're not hurting them by paying for UFC events, but at the same time, you're kind of buying into a business model that it's not trickling down the way you'd necessarily expect. And the UFC as it exists, and it's going to change now because it's been sold. But look, when the Fertitta brothers and that with Dana White bought it, when they bought it back in the early 90s, I think my timeline's no, I'm sorry.
It was mid-90s,
Mid-90s.
Yeah.
And because it has its breakthrough. It might have even been right around 2000. They bought it. It was appearing in little casinos in Mississippi. It was the dark ages of it. It was Tunica, different places like that. They bought debt is essentially what they bought. They bought the UFC's debt and got the name and came up with Zuffa and all those things. They deserve credit for building it to what it is. And it wasn't like they took over some sort of streamlined enterprise and then started raking in the profits. But at the same time, you now have, I believe MMA is more visible than boxing. I believe that the broadcast contracts that it gets, the money generated by MMA, if not greater than boxing, is right on par with it. Yet fighter salaries are nowhere close to what top-tier boxers get.
Even mid-level boxing. I'm a boxing fan, and there are a lot of guys I'm not even aware of. I'll watch some of the Showtime late night where they bring up incomers and things like that, or I'll watch a major card that's got, you know, some of the undercard fighters I've never heard of, but then you'll read about their paydays are 3, 4, 5 times what some of the biggest names in MMA are making. You know, guys that aren't. I'm not talking Floyd Mayweather, Manny Pacquiao, or anybody of that ilk. I'm talking guys that, I've heard of, but aren't household names by any stretch of the imagination, and they might be getting $275,000 for that fight. Now, they still have taxes. They still have to pay their trainers. They still have to pay sanctioning fees, and it doesn't mean that's the check they're walking home with, but it's light years ahead of somebody who's getting a guarantee of, 38 and 38. I mean, they've got all these odd numbers in the UFC for whatever reason, but, and if you don't win fight of the night, all right, but you win your fight, okay, well, you're making, $76,000, and then your manager gets a cut, your trainer gets a cut, the tax is taken out. I mean, ultimately, these guys, and if they fight twice in a year, 3 times if they're lucky and can stay healthy, it's really crazy to think that somebody that is that big a part of what that night is, whether they're the main event, co-main event, their face is on the poster, they're in the commercials, they're doing the UFC embedded show that leads up to it, all of that they're such a major part of it, but then when it's all said and done in the wash, they get such a small sliver of what ultimately came of it. And it's not even comparable to boxing. It really isn't. When you're talking about guys that are on Showtime, guys that are on ESPN, they're not getting rich, but comparatively speaking, they're way ahead of the game. And they're not nearly as known.
Now, also, the part of this is you would assume that the market would eventually take care of this, right? Because that's how capitalism is supposed to work.
Right.
If there's all this money to be made off of MMA fights, and you've got one promotion in this case, which is the UFC, that isn't paying its fighters well, you have another promotion that rises up and says, hey, we're going to give you more money than them. And we're going to be able to, we'll still make our profit, but we're going to build a business based on giving the fighters more money. And I think one of the arguments is that that has happened. Affliction started promotions. They went from being the T-shirt company. Do you have an Affliction T-shirt?
I was given one. I never wore it.
Never wore it?
No.
I've never worn an Affliction T-shirt.
I went to an Affliction event. I went to the Fedor Andrei Arlovsky fight. It was out there in California when I was living there.
Fedor, that's not the tire flipper, right?
Huh?
Fedor fought a tire flipper as well.
Brett Rogers?
Yeah, that was flipping tires the week before at Sam's Club.
No, Andrei Arlovsky. Where Arlovsky was doing well in the fight and then tried to do some sort of, was it a flying knee or some move where he just got clipped and the fight was over. But he was doing well up to that point. It was out there in California.
Who else was on that card?
Matt Lindland was on the card and got knocked out in a really ugly way, really scary way.
Lindland is another guy that went sideways with the UFC, and his complaint was actually he's a really good fighter, but he's pretty boring. He's a grind guys down, and that was his complaint, was that he developed an exceptionally boring style of beating the hell out of people. And so the UFC didn't want to promote him because they didn't think he was an exciting enough fighter.
Yeah, it's like John Fitch.
Yeah, Fitch is another one that's in that same sort of category.
Yeah, Ben Askren is a guy who's nothing but a wrestler, beats everybody wrestling. UFC wants nothing to do with him, and he's been incredibly outspoken and ripping the UFC. I mean, he's never been signed by him, and he's not going to be. But, yeah, a guy that wins but isn't a draw, isn't compelling. And Fitch was a guy that would win but was pretty boring to watch in the eyes of a lot of fans, and the UFC felt he was expendable, and there you go.
And we've seen other promotions, Affliction, Strikeforce also was one that get pushed around by the UFC and oftentimes ultimately bought by the UFC.
Yeah.
WEC was another one. Yeah. WEC was interesting because they did a great job of promoting some of the lighter weight classes that the UFC absolutely ignored and kind of opened their eyes to it. But they had upper divisions as well, and the UFC eventually bought them. Why don't you think we've seen a second rival promotion really emerge?
I just don't think they have the resources. I mean, Bellator is as close as it gets, and they've got a TV deal with Spike. What they're paying in comparison, I'm not really sure. You hear the guys that go there say, now I'm being treated great. I don't know if they're just saying that because they were cast off from the UFC. I mean, you could name, two fighters that have gone in their prime, Benson Henderson and Phil Davis, that have gone to Bellator. Am I missing anybody that's gone there in their prime?
In their prime? No,
I mean, you've got Tito Ortiz there, and you've got other guys that have been stars at the UFC level, but they're washed up. They're way past their prime.
Is Chael really going to fight Tito? Is that going to happen?
Yeah. That's what that promotion does. I mean, I don't love it as an MMA fan because it becomes the sideshow element we talked about in the past. But if that's going to be, hey, this is where we're going to differentiate ourselves, this is how we're going to establish our brand, help yourself. We'll do the Kimbo Slice Dada 5000 fight. I hate that stuff. I hate the Gracie versus Shamrock when they're both 83 years old. But maybe that's how they make their money. That's how they can pay fighters more. Maybe I don't really know. But
would you be more interested in Shamrock? Severn or whoever else he's going to fight. Who was it? Shamrock. If they gave him canes, made it like a Singapore cane match.
Sure.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. There's the sideshow element. I mean, I'm not going to tell you I didn't watch those fights. I watched Kimbo and Dada, and I sat there and shook my head in disgust. I watched Shamrock and Kimbo, and then I watched Shamrock and Gracie, and both times I sat there and went, "This is absurd.
Yeah,
this
Shamrock
is embarrassing to the
sport.
It's terrible for the legitimacy of the sport in my mind, but." I mean, Bellator's got a Spike deal, which is Viacom. They've got big backers. They don't really. I think they've done a handful of pay-per-views that I don't know have gone very well. But they're. I don't think anybody's got the resources that the UFC has. They've got the $500 million deal with Fox.
Mm-hmm.
They've got a built-in audience that believes we're the NFL. You want to watch Bellator? That's the USFL. That's Canadian football. Help yourself. It's a lesser product, and I think it's going to take a while to convince people that is on par, because I don't think it is on par. There are some fighters. They've got some really, really good fighters that fight for Bellator, no question, that can compete in the UFC. But by and large, you don't have the names that people are going to tune. I got to watch this guy. Their biggest names are some of their washed-up guys, and Tito Ortiz and things like that. So I don't think they can compete on that level. They just don't. They don't have the roster of stars yet. They've got money. I don't think they've got UFC money, but they've got money. But you see how it is. They're getting guys that are, Rory McDonald is another one that just went over there, and we'll see how they do. But it feels like it's such a huge gap. As much as Bellator is present, it feels like there's a massive gap between them and the UFC in terms of in terms of just being known, in terms of people that watch and are familiar with it.
You're listening to Fight. It's time for us to get in the cage. We've got Nate Quarry. He's going to join us next, brought to you by Emerald Queen Casino, where occasionally you'll get splattered with blood.
That's if you're sitting in front of the cage. I think Aaron was just fine. I don't think he was splattered by blood, right? Maybe some beer.
Yeah, maybe a little beer, but no blood.
And he splattered it on himself.
I thought you were going to say you get splattered if you're lucky.
Well, no, you're not. It's no good. Nobody wins that. Nobody wins with that.
Do you burn the shirt? Do you burn the shirt after it gets dotted with blood?
No, first thing I do is I come home and I immediately squirt it with a spray and wash. So it just soaks. I just let it sit there.
And then you take it to the dry cleaner?
And then it goes in the washing machine.
It goes in the washing machine?
Yeah.
I thought you wouldn't want it to soil because at some point some of that stuff's going to be in your washer, right?
No, it's hot. It's hot. It's going to get killed. Any of the germs it's going to get killed. It's going to be hot in the dryer. Yeah, it's going to be fine.
We love Emerald Queen, and Nate Quarry's going to join us next.
Hello.
Hey, Nate.
Hey,
It's Bob Stelton. How are you, man?
I'm good. Good morning.
Hey, I'm here with my buddy Danny O'Neill. He's going to be with us on this this conversation here. I was just telling him about that event you did with the special needs kid.
Oh, yeah. His name is Jacob Beckman, and he had Down syndrome.
Okay.
And he'd been training in MMA, I think, for 3 years, and just working his butt off, and kept asking his coach when he could finally have a fight. And, everybody told him, no, that's not in the cards for you, my friend. And I got wind of this. There was some discussion on Facebook about it. Mike Pierce's wife was actually talking about it. And I said, if you guys are looking for somebody to step in the ring with him, I'm your guy. Let's do this.
That's awesome, man.
It was really cool. It was such a cool thing. I know it was a while ago, Nate, and you've talked about it a bunch, but it was really cool for people that have seen that video. He comes walking to the cage, the kid does, with sunglasses on, and he's got the attitude and all that. It was an awesome, awesome thing.
Man, I honestly, it surprised me so much to see how big this blew up, because to me it was just, I kind of go through my life and I look at everything that I have. Like somebody asked me a few months ago, they're like, oh, we'd love to have you out for another seminar, but times are tough. We'll pass a hat, see what we can do. And I just looked at him. I went, man, I'm good. I've got food money. If you guys really need help and I'm the one that you want to give it to you, just hit me up. I'll be more than happy to be there. And that counters, I had so many people. I was trying to get somebody to make an appearance for my Zombie Cage Fighter music video, and it would have been a 5-minute thing. And he just says, no, I don't do anything that I'm not getting paid for. Yeah. It's like, man, you must have one hollow life if that's your main motivation for everything that you do.
Tell me about the video for Zombie Cage Fighter, Nate. That sounds fantastic.
How did that go down? I was working with a woman for a minute that was just kind of helping me with the brand of Zombie Cage Fighter, and she knew this band down in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they wrote a song and did all the music for it, and we just put together this music video where it's kind of a spoof of Zombie Cage Fighter. And Zombie Cage Fighter is my biographical horror story plus zombies, basically, what I've been through as a fighter and as a father. And then it's a mix of The Walking Dead meets Bloodsport, or The Walking Dead meets Rocky. You've got somebody who's just his whole life, everything has just failed miserably, and he gets one last opportunity to try and make something happen. And for me, that's stepping into the cage against a zombie. And if it works out well, I'll have some food money for my little girl. And if not, well, then next week I'll be the zombie on the rotten side of the cage.
How many issues are out now?
I did issue 0 in 2012. I've got issue 1 and 2 done, and issue 3 is about 99% done. And we're starting on issues 4, 5, and 6 now that'll tell the whole story. It's taken forever to do this. Just, man, working with artists is about as difficult as working with fighters, I think. But it's coming out really well. I'm excited for when it finally gets done.
Where can people get it? Because I see you talking about it on Twitter and things like that. But it seems like it's got kind of a cult following already. But for those that aren't aware of it, where can they find it?
ZombieCageFighter.com is a big thing. Other than that, if you find me at a comic book convention I'm doing, like I do Rose City Comic Con here in Portland, have a booth and just stand there for a couple of days and sell T-shirts and comic books and have fun at the Comic Con. And I don't even have the new issues 1 and 2, on ZombieCageFighter.com. You can only buy issue 0. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is I'm terrible at online stuff. My last computer course I took was literally about 30 years ago. So I'm so bad at that. But then secondly, that phrase you just said, underground cool, is exactly what I want Zombie Cage Fighter to be. Because I remember fighting Gustavo Jimo Machado in King of the Cage, or Gladiator Challenge. I think it was King of the Cage. And this must have been, 15 years ago. And there was this small clothing company there that was really kind of making a presence called Tap Out. And these were just these cool guys who were going to the shows and were really passionate about it. And now Tap Out has made their money. You can buy their shirts at Kmart. But 15 years ago, it was underground cool. So I want Zombie Cage Fighter, as much as I would love the millions upon millions of dollars, I want Zombie Cage Fighter to be underground cool and to have people kind of feel like they're in the know when they get one of my new shirts, my new comic or something.
Now, who is tougher to organize, artists or fighters? Because you know some pretty difficult to organize fighters. So you're friends with Chris Lieben and some of the other guys down there from Portland.
Oh, jeez.
I love that response when you bring his name up.
Lieben's awesome.
He is. He's a basket case. He is trying to corral kittens all on his own, trying to keep him on track. I've had so many ridiculous stories with that guy. But the best thing about working with fighters is when you're unhappy with something, you can always punch them in the face. When it comes to artists, you have to tell them over and over again how wonderful they are, how much you love their work, how their body odor is pleasing, and if, by the way, if they wouldn't mind doing the job they agreed to take a few months ago, that would be kind of cool too.
Their body odor is pleasing. That's a way to get the work done quicker. That is awesome.
All right. Well, we are here. It's Fight, an MMA podcast, and we're joined by Nate Quarry. You can follow him on Twitter, Nate Rock Quarry. Nate, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Always a pleasure with you guys.
What are you up to these days? And I think it's interesting because I consider myself one of the generation of fans who was really brought into the sport by guys like you and guys who are on the Ultimate Fighter 1 and that sort of that generation of fighters. What are you up to these days, and kind of what's been the next step for you in fighting?
I'm staying so busy. I always say if I'm sitting on the couch watching TV, that means I'm procrastinating because I've got so much stuff that I should be doing at all times. We're moving forward with a lawsuit against the UFC because we believe that the UFC monopolized the sport by buying up so much of the competition or causing it to close down. And then by controlling the contracts, putting out these exclusive contracts, such as when somebody wins a world championship, you would think that is their shining moment. Now they really have power for their career. And instead, the UFC contracts have a clause where if you win a UFC title, you are immediately re-upped in your contract and you cannot renegotiate, or at least you don't have the power to renegotiate on the open market. And then you have things like just threats and intimidation that the UFC would do over the years, where if you do not play by the games that they set out for you, you don't follow their rules, well, then they'll put you on an undercard. They won't give you exposure. They won't give you a good fight for yourself. So we're heading that lawsuit up, and then I truly believe one of the biggest strengths that will help the fighters is the Ali Act. And the Ali Act is what boxers have in place to protect them from promoters, from controlling the rankings and manipulating of the rankings, for having an investment in a boxer. Sports is supposed to be pure. It's supposed to be two people that show up and just go at it, or two teams. And we've seen the UFC over and over again manipulating the rankings, deciding who fights who, deciding what the pay scale is, doing all these things to maintain their death grip over the sport. the Ali Act will change that, and we've got a bill going through Congress right now. It's going to expand the Ali Act to cover MMA, to cover kickboxing, even to cover jiu-jitsu, should the time come when those sports become as big as MMA, or they just need protection as well. It's all combat sports. Why can't it just be a wide umbrella? And then working with the MMAFA, the MMA Fighters Association. Every big sport out there has an association, the NFL Players Association, MLB Players Association, NBA Players Association, where everything that is decided, the athletes actually have a say in it. The NFL, a few years ago, decided they wanted to extend the season by 2 more games. And, boy, on paper, that sounds great. Why wouldn't you want 2 more football games in the year? The players get to play more, make some money for those 2 games. The fans get to see 2 more games, all these things. It just sounded like a great deal until you start looking at what the NFL Players Association had to say. Okay, well, the injury rate in the NFL is 100%. And the length of the average career in the NFL is about 3.5 years. So adding in 2 more games, 6 more games in 3 years, is going to mean that a lot of players now are not going to hit that 3.5 year mark. They're going to be retired by year 3, which means that they won't get their benefits. There's always 2 sides of the story, and I recall so clearly when the UFC made the declaration a few years ago that main event fights were no longer 3 rounds. It used to be only title fights were 5 rounds, but the UFC decided the fans want 5-round main events. They want to see more finishes. We're going to do 5-round main events for every single card. And on paper, that's another one of those things that sounds great. Well, the fighters get 2 more rounds to prove who's the best. The fans get 2 more rounds to see these great fights. Of course, there was no more compensation for that. Technically, you're working for 15 minutes, and now your workday has been extended by 10 more minutes, 2/3 of the day. And your entire camp has to change. You have to do completely different conditioning to train for 5 rounds instead of 3 rounds. And they just came down from on top and said, this is the way it is now, and no, we're not compensating you any differently for a 5-round fight than we were a 3-round fight. And if we had the MMAFA in place right there, we would have just sat back and said, no, you don't get to just tell us these wide sweeping changes without sitting down with the athletes and coming to terms on these things. You're doing this. Let's be clear. The UFC doesn't do anything because they think the fans will enjoy it. They do it because they feel it will make more money. And it reminds me so clearly when I think it was the first UFC summit when they would bring in fighters from around the world and kind of sit down and tell them how you can act, what you can say, all of these things that the UFC wanted the fighters to carry their brand. And at the end, they had a question and answer. And one of the fighters raised his hand, I want to say it was Yves Edwards, and said, are you guys ever going to list a ranking system that shows who is the next in line for a title shot? And Dana White started laughing. And he said, I don't care who you think is in line for a title shot. I'm putting together the fights that the fans want to see, that the fans will buy the pay-per-views for if I put them together. And I remember listening to that and just saying, my God, this has nothing to do with who's the best in this sport any longer. It's all about who the UFC can manipulate and who they can drive to the super fights or the title fights. And the fighters really have no say in this. Well, my goal is for the fighters to have the rights like every other sporting organization does.
What kind of feedback have you gotten from active fighters? Because it seems like most of the people I talk to, whether it's journalists or people that cover the sport, say they love the effort, they love what's going into it, but they said in order for it to truly be effective, you got to have somebody who's a draw, who's in their prime, like a Conor McGregor, or I know George St. Pierre is on the outside of it now, is still a big name, but hasn't been fighting, and his attorney is echoing everything you're saying. Is it going to take a big name, somebody who's in the prime of their career that has some level of leverage to jump on board with you to get this truly to the spot it needs to be?
That would definitely help. But if you look at all of these, like you mentioned, NFL, MLB, NBA, they all started with 1 or 2 people or just a group of guys that said, look, we're not happy with this, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to change things. And on our side, a big part of that has been the UFC lawsuit where myself, Kung Lee, John Fitch, Kyle Kingsbury, as some others got together and said, we don't believe this is legal. We're going to do what we can to change it. And we believe through our antitrust lawsuit, we are going to prove that the things that the UFC has done is illegal and the way that they do business is illegal. And when the Ali Act passes as well, that's going to change the way the UFC does things. Just those two things right there give us so much teeth to change the business. But to your question, every fighter I talk to wants change. They're just so afraid of making their voice heard. But now they're getting louder because more and more fighters are voicing up. When it's one person complaining, and I remember being yelled at by Burt Watson, who used to head up the show.
Yep.
He was the go-to guy at every UFC live event. He made sure everybody was where they were supposed to be, when they were supposed to be. And I was down there complaining because I was cornering Chris Lieben at the Palms. He was fighting at the Palms. Our hotel room was at the Palms. We make weight at the Palms. You do the weigh-ins at the Palms. Chris Lieben could use the workout room at the Palms for free. The rest of his fight camp had to pay to use the workout room. So I've got to go sit with Chris Lieben for 3 or 4 hours to make sure that he makes weight at 185, sit in their sauna, work with him on the treadmill. I have to pay the Palms Casino to use their weight room to do that while we're fighting at the Palms, staying at the Palms, training at the Palms. And I just lost my mind. I said, this is ridiculous. They're trying to nickel and dime us for every little thing. All they would have to do is say, hey, Palms, we're bringing this live fight to your casino. I want the fighter to have 5 passes to use the weight room for the week for free. It's those little things that make the difference. It makes you feel appreciated and respected. And I voiced this to Burt Watson, which was the wrong thing to do. He was a UFC employee at the time. He's towing the line. He's got his job to do. I had mine. But he was the closest guy I could find. And I said, Burt, this is ridiculous. Why is the UFC, why don't they care anything about the fighters? Why do they let these little things like this? Not only are we getting paid horribly, we have to pay for our own fight camps, all these things. We have to pay to use the gym at the casino where we're fighting. If I was fighting for King of the Cage, they would cover that. And Burt Watson starts yelling at me and says, you are the only one here complaining about these things. You just need to do your job, get in line, shut up, and go to work. And I said, yeah, I'm the only one here complaining because I'm the only one that has the guts to right now. Because I've stood behind the curtain and I've seen what goes on there, and I see how much money you all are making and how it's never enough for you people, that it will never be enough. And now that the fighters see that the UFC was just sold for $4 billion, and the owners of the UFC were already billionaires, and this is on top of the hundreds of millions, if not billions, that they made in profit over the past 20 years. We've been sold on this over and over again. Oh, we're barely scraping by. We're barely making any money. We can't afford this. And as fighters, I would like to think that we're mostly fairly honest people, because if we lie, it gets pulled out into light pretty quickly. If we say we're better than we really are, it shows in our next fight. So I think honest people have a hard time comprehending that other people will blatantly lie about things like profit and loss and how much you're worth and the manipulation of the rankings. So and now you've got these fighters that are seeing this. Well, geez, they told me they can only afford to pay me $10,000 to fight on the main card of this pay-per-view. But wait a minute, they just sold the UFC for $4 billion? How does that work? You're getting the fighters now who are starting to understand, because you can pay somebody horrible wages and treat them really well, and they'll stick around. Or you can treat somebody terrible, but pay them a lot of money, and they'll stick around. The UFC has consistently been paying horrible wages and treating the athletes with such disrespect that finally guys are starting to wake up and stand up, and they're losing the fear. They're wanting to stand up and voice their opinion for change, and it's going to happen. It's just going to take some time.
One of the most puzzling things, Nate, watching the rising popularity of MMA, where I believe more people are watching MMA now than boxing. I think more people are buying the pay-per-views and that it's become a more prominent sport. Yet the pay for boxers and the pay for MMA fighters is drastically different. I've always thought one of the reasons is because unlike boxing where you have promoters and sanctioning bodies, essentially you have the UFC, which is the promotion and in many ways also the sanctioning body. Even though say, no, we're just a fight promotion, they're the ones that have the titles. They're the ones that decide who fights for the titles. In many ways, they're both entities. And then you throw in the fact that they've been pretty ruthless with any rival promotions, anyone else that has come out and tried to gain a toehold in the national audience.
That's exactly right. Because there's no sanctioning body in MMA, if you have a problem with the UFC or how you're being treated by the UFC or even one of the athletic commissions, Nevada State Athletic Commission, you then have to go in front of the UFC or the athletic commission. There is no sanctioning body that you can go plead your case to that is impartial, that just wants to see justice done, to make sure that the right thing is done. That doesn't exist in the world of MMA. Take, for example, Kung Lee. He had a fight over in Asia. Now it's been a couple years ago. And the UFC they have this great policy on drug use. So they want to shut it down. That's wonderful. My problem there is, of course, in all the other major sports, the athletes have a say in this. Mm-hmm. And now they're chasing the athletes down around the world. You have to report where you are to the UFC 24 hours a day. If you travel and do not let the UFC know that, they will sanction you. They will send you a warning letter. You did not let us know where you were. This is strike one. If you get 3 strikes in a year, they suspend you for 2 years. 2 years of your career because you didn't let the UFC know you were going on vacation to Hawaii. These types of things they're just these knee-jerk reactions. But getting back to Kung Lee, so the UFC said, we're gonna show everybody how tough on drugs we are. So when Kung Lee fought Bisping, I think in Macau, they sent someone local there to give him a drug test. Well, the drug tester that they sent worked at a mom and pop shop there who tests for things like marijuana if your kids are using. They don't do professional drug tests for sporting events. They tested Kung Lee for human growth hormone and came out and said, Kung Lee guilty, caught using it with elevated levels of human growth hormone. And as soon as I read that news report, my first response was, I didn't realize that they had a reliable test for HGH, for human growth hormone, directly after a fight, which is the case because they don't. If you're going to test for HGH, you have to be resting and fasting for 12 hours in a very calm area. Not 15 minutes after you lost a fight against Michael Bisping, who is now the world champion. The guy drawing blood took him 3 times to hit it. Kung told me that his blood was squirting across the room. Eesh. And when it came out that this test was completely bogus and Kung was completely innocent, he then had to go or send his agent to stand in front of Dana White and his army of lawyers and convince them that they had made a mistake and they need to clear Kung's name. And the story ends with Kung's agent standing in front of them, convincing them, look, you have screwed over my client. You need to make this right. Kung Lee then sometime later gets a phone call from Dana White. So this was kind of interesting how this went down. The meeting is over. Kung's agent leaves Dana White's office. Kung is at the dentist, I think, getting a filling filled or something like that, a cavity filled. He sees the phone ring. It's from Dana White. He can't take the call. He hands it off to his dentist. The dentist actually tells Dana, Kung Lee is being worked on by a dentist right now. You'll have to call back. So Kung then calls his agent, Gary Ibarra from the AMR group, and says, Dana White has called me. What's the story? And Gary Ibarra, his agent, says, well, I think we've dealt with this. They realize that they have no proof about this, that you are completely innocent. But they're not happy. The last thing they want to do is admit that they made a mistake. My guess is Dana White is calling you to try to get you to say something that will convict you or admit your culpability in this or something like that. So just be aware of when Dana calls back or something. He's probably going to record this phone call. So Kung says, okay, well, that's fine. I don't have anything to hide, but that's interesting. So Kung calls Dana back, calls the office back. He's told Dana White's not available right now. Can he return your phone call a little bit later? Kung says, fine. A minute later, Dana calls back. So now he's calling back on a line that he most likely then can record the conversation. Well, it's all speculation, but that seems kind of likely. So Dana gets Kung on the phone, and Dana says, Kung, there's been a lot of athletes throughout the years that have used performance-enhancing drugs, a lot of professional baseball stars, these types of things. And when the athletes just come out and admit it, the public, they forgive them, and they adore them, and they can move on with their life. We know you use drugs. Just come out and admit it. We'll stand by you. And Kung just starts laughing and just says, I didn't use anything, and hangs up the phone. It's just the most ridiculous scenario. You couldn't write this in a movie. It would be too unbelievable that an athlete would then have to go in front of the people that want to convict him, who want to say, no, he was using drugs and we're tough on drugs. And here we are now saying, okay, so you released Kung Lee's drug test saying that he had elevated HGH. Let's see the other athletes that you tested that night as well. Let's see Michael Bisping's HGH report, because we know as a fact that the UFC has hidden failed drug tests in the past. Vitor Belfort tested positive for a banned substance before he fought John Jones for the title. The reason I know this was because the drug test that Vitor Belfort had failed accidentally got emailed to members of the MMA media. And I say MMA media because they are not real live media that wants to just tell the story, tell the truth. I've had so many members of the MMA media tell me, we can't cover this story, we can't cover your story because we want to go to the fights. And if we do, they won't give us a press pass. And so Vitor Belfort fails this drug test. It gets emailed around to the MMA media. The UFC realizes their mistake, then sends out a follow-up email saying, if any of you leak this, we will end your business. We will end your career. We will sue you into oblivion. Finally, years later, it turns out that Vitor Belfort had tested positive for drugs, for performance-enhancing drugs, for some form of steroids, I don't recall. And when the UFC found out about it, they just buried the test so they could still have their main event of Vitor Belfort versus John Jones. And you just have to look at this and go, this is just maniacal. This is comical how evil this is. That you're going to pretend to be tough on drugs with one guy when you've botched the test. And then when you have clear-cut black and white evidence that another person has failed a drug test, you're going to sweep it under the rug so you can continue to have your pay-per-view. That's just insanity.
Well, as far as it pertains to Vitor, I think anybody who had any questions as to whether he was doing anything needn't look any further than his last fight or the fight before that, since the whole TRT thing was relegated as illegal or against the rules. He looks like he's melting now. The guy was an Adonis, absolutely shredded, and then as soon as the TRT thing went down, he looks like a melted candle. I mean, it's interesting, but just to go back for a minute, I know we were talking about in boxing how they have the sanctioning bodies. They've got the WBC, WBA, IBF, all of that. So you've got something separate from you've got the promoter, you've got the promotions and all that. The only issue I see with that is notoriously corrupt, filthy, dirty. I mean, you talk about manipulating rankings, getting in bed with promoters. Jose Sulaiman from the WBC was about as dirty as anybody could ever hope to be, and all of a sudden here's Danny O'Neill as the number one contender, and nobody's ever heard of the guy, and he's the mandatory, and if you don't fight him, you get stripped of your title, and then you're paying these outrageous sanctioning fees. If you're going to defend our belt, we take $80,000 of your purse or $100,000 of your purse. So as much as I understand the conflict of interest in the UFC and MMA, it doesn't work well in boxing from my perspective as an old school boxing fan. It's one of the more filthy things in sports that you see. So I'm wondering, do you think there's a middle road there somewhere that would work? Because that is a really flawed system.
Well, let me ask you this: what do you think of America's democracy? It's pretty good form of government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Up until
And
this
yet we
year.
look at all the corruption. Well, you know what they say about democracy. It is actually the worst form of government there is until you compare it to every other option.
Right.
So, yeah, a sanctioning body could at some point lead down that road to corruption. But we have a corrupted system right now. So a sanctioning body may be the worst form of managing an entire sport until you compare it to giving all of the control to a single entity, as has been done for the past 20 or so years.
That's a fair point.
Where we see blatantly this manipulation, the paydays behind the scenes, the manipulation of the rankings. At least once we have the Ali Act in place, that will give us some teeth, that we'll be able to sue these promotions, set things right. Nothing is ever going to be perfect, but it's a damn sight better than what we've got going now. I'll take our democracy over communism or outright socialism any day, knowing how corrupt it is, seeing how messed up our political system is right now, and being on the inside with the UFC, fighting for them for so many years, being on the first season, The Ultimate Fighter, seeing all the corruption and the manipulation when fighters are told, oh, we want you to fight for the world title for pennies. And the fighter says, well, no, I'm not going to do that. I want to renegotiate. I think it was Pete Spratt that was telling me this the other day. They offered him such a low amount. And he said, well, no, I can't afford to fight for the world title for that little amount of money. And they just said, fine, then you will never fight for the world title, and never got a title shot. That is the most blatant manipulation that there is. We tell you where to fight, when to fight, who to fight for, with, how much you're fighting for, what you can wear. Oh, by the way, you're independent contractors, so go out and do whatever you want, but you can't use any of your image, likeness, fighting. You can't use the term UFC champion on your website, things like this. It's just time for a change. And I am sure that, without a doubt, as they always say, with absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it's a lot better than what we've got going at right now. And I would rather hand the reins over to a bunch of fighters who actually care about the sport than a bunch of promoters that just care about the almighty dollar.
No, that's a fair point. And Nate, I know you got to get going here in a minute. I just want to throw one last thing at you. I think there are a lot of people from the outside that got excited over the idea that it was being sold, thinking, all right, there's going to be some level of change. You've got this management company that represents superstars, and you've got superstar owners now that are minority owners, and Cam Newton and Tom Brady and Conan O'Brien and all these people that have a platform and a name are invested in this product, and somehow it was going to change for the better. And then you see the immediate is they've cut their staff overall by 15%. I think they just trimmed 13 fighters off the roster. And I don't know what did you expect, I guess, is the question. Did you expect that this would be for the better once it was sold, or did you kind of envision what we're seeing?
I knew this was exactly how this would go down. If you have something that's making money, if you're winning the game, if you're playing Monopoly and you get to use 2 dice and your opponent has to use 1 dice, you get twice as much money at the start. He gets half as much. If you collect $200 every time he passes go, if he goes directly to jail every time he passes go, why would you want to change the rules? You're already winning. These guys who bought the UFC didn't do it thinking, now we can change the sport. Now we can really pay these athletes what they're worth. We're only making, we're making 70% of the gross income is all profit. Let's share that. Let's give some more money to the fighters. It never works that way. And it's so amazing. You mentioned all the celebrities now that are buying in. And boy, that sure sounds cool. I thought it was really cool when I first heard that I was going to be in the UFC video game. And then when I sent a copy of the UFC video game to my mortgage company, and they sent it back saying, we don't accept video games with our client's likeness in it as payment, I went, I guess I need actual money to pay my bills as opposed to photos with cool celebrities, as opposed to trading cards I'm not getting paid for, as opposed to video games that the UFC brags about selling 2 million copies and none of the fighters got a dime for it. A lot of those things sound really cool until you head back to the real world. And how long would you do your absolute dream job and it took 40, 50 hours a week if you got paid $0? And if your dream job was exhausting, like fighting, how long can someone fight for free? Not very long. because of the toll on your body, the amount of time that it takes, and the bills that you have to pay. And I'm seeing a lot of fighters now. One of my favorites, Kyle Kingsbury, had to retire because he was getting paid so little. And he's looking at, well, geez, I've got a college degree. I want to start a family, and he has now. I want to build a future for myself. And I can't do that fighting 2 or 3 times a year. And the wages may be half as much because I lose a fight. Now the sponsorships are gone, all of these things. It's such a tough career, and we all want to live our dream. And we're very lucky if we get that point. But fighting isn't a charity. It's not like we're fighting to cure cancer. No, everybody's fighting for money at the end of the day. Don't start fighting for money, but you have to treat it like a business because your manager is, the promoter is. Everybody there is getting paid, and the UFC is making so much money off of these athletes. To think that anything was going to change, that these cutthroat businessmen stepped in and said, let's buy this and let's give money back. It just doesn't work that way. And we see now that the matrices that they need to make their bonuses, to make their salaries, are intent upon cutting the costs, making sure they get their bonuses. And that's going to happen by keeping fighter pay as low as possible. And it's so ridiculous to me because they still believe that the UFC itself is the product. It's not. Whenever somebody says, oh, I'm a huge fan of the UFC, I say, oh, what part of their business model do you like? Oh, do you really enjoy the lighting? Is it the cage? The CEO really impresses you, with the way they've done things and how they treat people? Or is it the fighters that you actually like? Because I have yet to see a UFC pay-per-view with Dana sitting in the middle of the cage talking about how awesome he is and how great the UFC is and no fights. The product is the fighters. And as we win the MMA FA, as we get the fighters involved in that, as we win the lawsuit, as we win the Ali Act, then the fighters themselves are going to be the ones with the power. That's when things are really going to change, and they're going to get paid what they're worth. Fighters are going to fight. That's what we do. Fans are going to show up and watch those fights. Even if it's in a parking lot, fans are going to show up and watch. Promoters are the only unnecessary part of that equation, and they're the ones that reap most of the benefits. It's time for that to change.
He is Nate Quarry. You can follow him on Twitter, Nate Rock Quarry. You can also check out zombiecagefighter.com. Get issue 0.
They look cool, by the way. You need to check them out. I'm not even a comic book guy, and it looks very, very cool.
And you're going to have to keep your ear to the underground to find out the issues 1 and 2 because those are kept underground cool. Nate, it's really cool to talk to you, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime. I love hanging with you guys.
All right. That is Nate Quarry, and we'll be back to wrap up this episode next. There's a lot to sift through there. Nate Quarry's exceptionally interesting. I think the idea of the litigation, as boring as that it may be to fight fans, probably something that will long-term be fairly important to the shape of the sport in the future.
Yeah, it's like we were talking about before. I'm even more conflicted after listening to Nate because he presents such a compelling argument, and I understand everything he says is valid. Right? I mean, there are a lot of things I don't think just the casual fan at home understands, and maybe they don't care. Maybe they just want to be entertained. I don't care. Just get them in there.
No, I think fans care. Fans.
You think they care how much these fighters are being paid?
They want the fighters to make a living wage. And I think if people knew that some of the guys that they watch on TV, and not the main event fighters certainly, but some of those guys are making money that you could make going to a bank and working at a bank, or Chris Lieben, who said he wished he would have driven truck because he would have had insurance and he would have had long-term health care and some of those different things. I think people care about that part of it.
Then what do you say now, the counter to that, and this isn't my position, but you hear other people say, nobody's forcing you to fight. Go, if you want to drive a truck, drive a truck. If you want to be a doctor, be a doctor. Nobody's forcing you to choose this as your line of work.
Completely agree with that. Here's the part, and this would be the element of where I feel like college football has some issues, is that if you choose to do a profession, you sort of accept what comes along with that in the road track. If you want to be a pro football player, you basically have to go play college football. There's no reasonable alternative for that. If you want to be a pro fighter, there are other alternatives, But the reality is that the UFC has such a huge market advantage and not only that, but they've bought up the competition, and whether they've put on free events against another promotion's pay-per-view events to try and suck out viewers of those different tactics which they have taken, it's pushing it to the point where you're like, you know what? That's not really fair. You have such a huge advantage in the marketplace. And the only reasonable destination for someone who wants to be a professional fighter is yours. And not only that, but you're set up in a way that does it really have to be that? And I go back, I love the point you made about boxing, is that this is the idea that we're holding up boxing as a more reasonable alternative is problematic in and of itself because the corrupt promotions.
It's filthy.
It's one of the reasons.
It has no credibility.
Right.
And it hasn't for decades.
And it's one of the reasons why we watch the UFC more than we watch boxing now, because they put on the fights you want to see. But at the same time, you look at some of the different things. You were just reading the story of George St. Pierre's attorney talking about what he saw in the contract that George had with the UFC, which he is no longer in effect and no longer enforced with George.
The UFC is saying it is. There's going to be a fight about this because St. Pierre's people are saying, no, they're in breach of the contract because of A, B, and C. And the UFC is saying, no. We still have a contract. We in fact, there was a statement here. I'll see if I can find it. So the UFC on Monday released a statement indicating that St. Pierre remains under contract with the promotion and that, quote, Zuffa intends to honor its agreement with St. Pierre and reserves its rights under the law to have St. Pierre do the same. So as much as St. Pierre's attorneys and representatives are saying, nope, contract's null and void, they're in breach of the contract because of this, you see the UFC's position. And St. Pierre is a rich man. I don't know to what extent he would fight this in the court of law, and because there's more money behind the UFC, clearly, as we've detailed. I don't know to what degree he goes forward with this, right? If it's going to be a long, drawn-out, expensive legal battle. He's a guy that's not a young guy. He's not. I believe he's got more fights in him if he truly wants to. But I'm wondering how much how inspired is he to truly see this through? I
would agree with that. Here's the other thing. I think the most likely resolution is that they redo his contract.
Which is what they've been trying to do.
Right. And that's what, I don't know if George St. Pierre, what alternatives does he have? He could go fight in Bellator.
Well, technically right now he can't because they're saying you're under contract.
There would be a fight there. But if say he's a free agent right now.
Right.
Say that his side is right in the interpretation that the contract, what else is he going to do? The fights that everybody wants to see are in the UFC.
Right.
And he might choose to go fight in Bellator. It's going to be against a lesser competition. I guess you could fight Rory McDonald there.
Which is his teammate and a kid that he's sort of groomed. He's not going to fight
There's
him.
no way that would happen. You're not really going to see there, and that kind of gets to some of the problem of how much of the market share that the UFC owns, that even someone who's in a fight and trying to leave, the reasonable fights, the things that are there inside the UFC.
Right.
It's a real challenge.
Do you feel conflicted as a fan?
Yeah, I do.
Because I feel like we're supporting the evil side, the evil empire. We're feeding into it. We're making it grow. We're part of the reason it is as big as it is. Yet I love these fighters, and I love and I can appreciate their story and what I can appreciate the sacrifice that they put into this and what they give up in order to attain this dream. And then to hear and read and see what's really being done behind the scenes. It's like hearing about, how the sausage is made or the hot dogs are made or whatever that saying is. You don't really want to know. Yeah. You know that it tastes good. You just don't want to know what's really going into it.
The two things that I think that you have, this is the same fight that professional athletes in all other sports have eventually had to make. Like NFL players, MLB players eventually had to form a union and do things to institute true free agency, other different things to skew the shape. Left to their own devices, I think owners will keep fair share is such a stupid expression because fair share doesn't really describe how capitalism works.
Right.
Left unchecked, owners are going to try to keep as much as they absolutely possibly can. That's what will happen. And eventually, I think we will see a collective organization that will go through. When it comes to the other stuff, I do feel conflicted. At the same time, I feel that the best thing for a sport to grow is for eyeballs to stay on it. And if it's a good product, eventually the other things will sort themselves out, whether it's through lawsuits, whether it's through activation, that by stopping watching it, are you going to actually change something? You just might make that thing, that entire discipline sort of shrivel up and die a little bit.
But what is their recourse? We're talking about how these guys are barely making a living as it is. So nobody's truly in a financial position to turn around and say, okay, let's go on strike. We're going to strike. We're not fighting until we get a fair deal. How many fighters in the UFC can truly afford to do something like that? I'm talking literally afford financially. You've only got a few guys in, whether it's Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey, John Jones. You've got a handful of fighters who may be able to financially get away with that. Where the rest of the roster, if they say, I'm going on strike until we get a better deal, I'm not fighting, well, you're in trouble financially. So I don't know what sort of recourse they have to get that momentum going or to affect change and not absolutely put themselves in the poorhouse.
Yeah, there's the simple answer to that is they're not. And probably a strike is probably that would not force it because there's so many people that would want to fight, and
Right.
and all of the different things we've seen. Like if you get two guys in a cage that are swinging at each other, it looks like people will watch it. So would they be able to wait it out? The lawsuit, that's something that has been used by organizations in the past, and whether it was the lawsuit that resulted in Kurt Flood being a free agent, like there will be things that will change that. I'll be interested to see what shape it takes, and you could have a very socially conscious fighter that becomes Conor McGregor, someone like that. I don't think Conor's shown any inclination to do that, where he's seen the sale of the UFC as evidence of his personal worth.
Well, and he's celebrating the difference in his purses versus everybody else. He's saying, I get fined more than these bums are getting paid.
No, he says booms.
These bums.
These booms.
These booms.
You and your entire boom town.
So he's sort of celebrating the inequity in the whole thing. You know, it's working out well for him.
It'll be interesting to see exactly how it goes forward. I enjoyed hearing Nate's perspective. I really liked your question about the boxing promotion too. Just that, we're going to hold up boxing as the paragon of virtue now. That's what it should aspire to be.
It's really bad.
Yeah.
If you paid any attention to the rankings in any of these sanctioning bodies, the IBF, WBC, all of a sudden a fighter you've never heard of who's fought nobody is the mandatory challenger. And if that champion chooses not to fight him, then they're stripped of the title. So it's such a dirty game of the promoter, Don King's got, hey, my boy Danny O'Neill here, he's going to get a shot. He needs to be the number one contender. Yeah, he's beaten nobody, but he needs to get that title fight. And you're working in cahoots with the head of those sanctioning bodies who all of a sudden place you as the number one contender. So champ has to fight you or champ gets stripped of his title.
How do you think the crowd would react when Danny O'Neill jogged out there? The waist of his shorts pulled up above his belly button to hide his gargantuan gut. Now introducing the furious typist. He is able to file on deadline, incapable of knocking out even a rival radio host.
It's just the visual of you with the waistband somewhere underneath your pecs.
Yeah. Danny, the donut hole O'Neill.
On the back of his trunks, it says journalistic integrity. Yeah, that's essentially what we've seen on a little smaller level, but guys that had no business being in there that somehow were all of a sudden the mandatory challenger and the sanctioning fees and how these sanctioning bodies just rip the champs off. Now you've got fighters who are, credit to Floyd. He's a guy who kind of started saying, why would I pay $200,000 to the WBC? Why would I do that? People are coming to see me fight. Nobody cares about you dumb little trinket.
Yeah.
Take your belt. Go ahead. So it's the fighters in boxing have smartened up and understood it's about the matchup. People want to see me fight Manny Pacquiao, or they want to see me fight Andre Ward, and nobody gives a damn about the belts anymore. Nobody even really knows who the champs are anymore because there's so many different belts. It's not just WBA, IBF, WBC. There's the WBO, the NABO, the NABF. I mean, there's all these ridiculous belts, and nobody even really knows who the owners are of each one of those.
Well, it's been a fun episode.
Yeah. Educational, right?
Yeah,
Hopefully it wasn't too boring for people.
Well, we talked to a guy that has a comic book called Zombie Cage Fighter.
It does look really cool.
Yeah.
If you get a chance to check it out, zombiecagefighter.com. But if you're a comic book fan, I would think you'd be into it. Like I was looking at it, maybe it's just because I know him a little bit. I was, this is cool. Maybe it's not. I don't know.
I loved it. We appreciate you listening. If you enjoy this podcast, again, the best thing you can do is leave us a review on iTunes, wherever you get the podcast. Also, spread the word. We are loving doing this, and we hope that you guys enjoy it too. And we'll talk to you next week on Fight, an MMA podcast.